Early one morning, 7-year-old Mark woke up to faint cries. In the dim room, his 7-month-old sister was crying from hunger, waving her tiny arms. She hadn't eaten since last night. By this time, their mother should have been preparing milk and feeding her rice cereal. "It's okay. Mom is resting, but I'm here," Mark whispered as he quietly approached his sister. However, a sense of anxiety began to spread in his chest. As his sister's cries grew louder, Mark hurried to the kitchen. Opening the fridge, he found it empty. Even the pantry held no cans of powdered milk or jars of baby food. Turning towards his mother, his heart sank. Elizabeth lay pale and motionless, breathing irregularly. Usually responsive to her daughter's cries, this morning she showed no signs of waking. Mark reached out to touch his mother's arm, finding her skin far too hot. "Mom, are you okay? Please, talk to me," Mark said, his voice catching as he noticed her shallow, labored breathing. Her heart condition, which had been troubling since the previous night, seemed to have worsened. Around her neck, an old butterfly-shaped necklace faintly glimmered. Elizabeth had always cherished it, saying, "This is a precious treasure of our family." During the days when her husband David was alive, the family enjoyed modest, happy times. David supported the family with his construction site wages, spending holidays picnicking in the park. He always said, "Happiness isn't about money. It's about the time spent with loved ones." But everything changed after David's fatal accident at the site a year ago. Elizabeth tried to work, but her lifelong heart condition hindered her. Their savings dwindled on medical and living expenses, and now they barely managed in a modest apartment on the outskirts of town. Recently, her condition had rapidly deteriorated. "William," Elizabeth murmured faintly. "Mark, your grandfather was William Hamilton." The words were barely a whisper, lost in her fading consciousness. Just then, a knock sounded at the door. Mark had heard rumors that a social worker and the police would visit, alerted by a neighbor. They were expected first thing in the morning. As his sister's cries intensified, Mark rushed back to the kitchen. But the fridge was still empty, and there was no milk to make a bottle. The knocking grew louder. "Anyone inside, please open up. Child Welfare Services," a voice called out. Returning to his mother, Mark found her breathing weak, her face pale as if gazing into the distance. "Mark, if they come, you and your sister will be separated." Her voice was thin, barely a thread. "Please, don't let them separate you. Take care of your sister." At her words, Mark's heart pounded. The thought of being separated from his sister tightened his chest. Having lost his father, and now with his mother fading, the prospect of losing his sister was unbearable. As the door banging intensified, Elizabeth weakly removed the butterfly necklace from her neck. "Mark, take this as your talisman." With trembling fingers, she placed the necklace around her son's neck, her gesture laden with all the life's emotions she had experienced. "It's okay, this necklace will protect you." Mark held his sister tightly in his arms. "I must be strong like Dad. Mom, I promise. I'll always protect Kate." As the door began to shake, he hugged his sister and dashed for the emergency stairs. Carefully, yet quickly, he descended the metal stairs, pressing his sister close to his chest against the cold morning air. Reaching the ground, he started running along the street, the necklace glinting faintly in the morning sun. Behind him, the sound of splintering wood followed by "They're not inside" echoed. Mark crouched low behind a hedge, gently patting his sister's back to keep her from crying. "Check the back door," a man's voice called out. "And the emergency stairs." As footsteps approached, Mark held his breath, gently swaying his sister. The officer's shoes passed by, a cold sweat ran down his back. "These tracks are fresh. They must be the children reported, with a 7-month-old infant. They can't have gone far." Mark quietly began to back away along the hedge, making sure the woman speaking didn't notice him. His sister's small fingers gripped his shirt tightly. "You're doing well, don't cry," he whispered to himself. "Let's split up. I'll take the east side. Roger that. Keep in touch via radio. As the footsteps faded, Mark slowly stood up, waiting until the officers were out of sight before running in the opposite direction, keeping as low a profile as possible to protect his sister. Emerging onto the street, Mark knocked on the first house he saw. Please help. My sister, she's just a baby and hasn't eaten anything. Mark cried out with a trembling voice, but the lights inside went out, and only the sound of a lock clicking responded. Through the next house's window, eyes peeked through the curtains. However, the door did not open, and soon the curtains were closed. Mark's heart sank. At the third house, a middle-aged woman cracked open the door, a chain still in place, and peered out warily. Alone with a baby, that's suspicious. Go home immediately. She snapped sharply, then shut the door. In the biting cold, Mark continued to walk desperately. In front of one house, a mother, upon seeing him, hurried back inside after stepping out to fetch the newspaper. Through the window, Mark saw her grab a cell phone, likely to call the police. Please wait. I really need help. Mark cried, but there was no response. Instead, a cold voice returned. I'm calling the police. Get away from here. Mark felt a tightness in his chest. Even when he dashed into a pharmacy, the clerk immediately asked, "Where are your parents?" in a questioning tone. Despite trying to explain, he was not heard out and was dismissed with, "Come back with an adult." Passers-by moved to the opposite side of the sidewalk to avoid him, some openly grimacing. No one stopped to listen. His sister's cries gradually weakened, and he could feel her small body getting colder. It's okay, I'll definitely find help. Mark muttered to himself, though his voice trembled. Tired and cold, he felt his hope fading gradually. Turning the corner, he saw people alighting from luxurious cars. Ladies in elegant dresses were mentioning a name. It's William's nephew's wedding, it must be quite lavish. It has the Hamilton family's typical flair. At that moment, Mark remembered his mother's words from that morning, her consciousness fading, she had murmured, "William. And your grandfather is William Hamilton." He gripped the necklace around his neck. Looking up, he saw St. Mary's Church and below it a sign, Hamilton Family Wedding. Hugging his shivering body as if to protect himself, Mark pressed his sister closer to his chest. It might be a mistake, but he had no other choice but to rush into the church. At the church entrance, a stern-faced security guard stood. Mark hesitated momentarily but felt his sister trembling and steeled his resolve. Seizing the moment when the guard looked away, he quickly slipped through a side door. The corridor, adorned with opulent decorations, echoed with the majestic sound of the pipe organ. The wedding had already begun. Mark crept towards the sound. From behind a large door, the pastor's voice could be heard. The bond between these two. At that moment, footsteps approached from behind. Hey, kid. What are you? Mark had no time to hesitate. He embraced his sister tightly and barged through the door. The heavy door swung open with a loud bang. The guests, clad in fancy dresses, turned all at once. Surprised murmurs filled the church, and the pipe organ stopped abruptly. Standing in front of the now open door, Mark froze. Beneath the dazzling light of the stained glass, hundreds of eyes stared at him. A murmur spread among the attendees dressed in luxurious dresses and tuxedos. Mark's legs trembled, but the feel of his sister's small body gave him courage. Step by step, he walked down the central aisle. Grab him. The voice of a security guard echoed from behind. Mark quickened his pace as the attendees expressed their shock, some standing up. The sound of the security guards' approaching footsteps grew louder. Then, an elderly gentleman in the front row stood up. With a commanding expression, he signaled the security guard to stop. Wait a moment. Silence spread through the hall. Mark stopped, trembling. The gentleman, his hair streaked with white and face stern, slowly approached him. The imposing figure clad in an expensive suit radiated an overwhelming presence. Mark's sister squirmed slightly. Reflexively, Mark hugged her tighter. Please, my sister hasn't eaten anything, no one would help us. At that moment, the necklace hanging from Mark's neck sparkled in the sunlight. The gentleman's eyes widened momentarily. Could you show me that necklace? His voice trembled slightly. Mark hesitated but, holding his sister with one arm, he gripped the necklace with the other. This is my mother's precious butterfly necklace. The gentleman's voice trailed off. The middle-aged man standing next to him also stared, eyes wide. Father, that's definitely Elizabeth's. The gentleman continued. My daughter who disappeared 12 years ago. A hushed silence enveloped the hall. Confused, Mark looked back and forth between the two men. He felt something unknown unfolding before him. Young man, what is your mother's name? The gentleman asked in a softer voice this time. Elizabeth. Elizabeth Hamilton. Mark deliberately mentioned the family name to indicate his mother was a Hamilton. But now, my mom is very sick. With those words, tears overflowed. No one believed us. I couldn't even feed my sister milk. The stern look on the gentleman's face faded, replaced by deep sadness and concern. Elizabeth, you said? His voice shook. Where is she? Where is my daughter? The urgency in his voice made Mark step back, but his eyes were filled with profound pain and longing. Mark answered while clutching his sister tighter. At the apartment. But my mom's condition, her heart. Mark choked on his words. The police were coming to separate us. Lead the way immediately, the gentleman instructed, then turned and called out to someone in the crowd. Dr. Johnson. From the back, a well-dressed man quickly approached. The gentleman continued, my car, then turned back to Mark. Don't worry. We will definitely help your mother. The wedding guests began to murmur at the sudden turn of events. At that moment, the middle-aged man next to the gentleman stepped forward and crouched down to Mark's eye level. My name is James. I'm your mother's brother. It must be hard holding your sister, isn't it? He said, gently offering his hands. Mark hesitated for a moment. He felt anxious about letting go of his sister, whom he had been protecting all this time. However, his arms were reaching their limit, and more than anything, there was a kindness in James's eyes that reminded him of his father. Relax. James said quietly. You've been protecting her alone all this time. Now let us help. Slowly, Mark transferred his sister into James's arms. James carefully took the baby and immediately took off his suit jacket to wrap her up. Michael, the gentleman turned to address the groom. We need to postpone the wedding. My grandchildren have been found. His voice trembled with barely contained emotion. Of course, Uncle. Michael immediately nodded, and the bride nodded slightly in agreement. Will you lead the way then? The gentleman asked Mark gently, now without his earlier authoritative demeanor, showing only a worried grandfather's face. Outside, a black limousine was waiting. Mark was urged to sit in the front passenger seat next to the driver. The gentleman, James, and Dr. Johnson got into the back seats, with James still holding the baby wrapped in his jacket. Where should I go? The driver asked Mark quietly. Mark began to describe the way to their apartment in as much detail as possible, and the car smoothly started moving through the city. Mark's heart was pounding. Looking out the window, the events of the past few hours felt like a dream. He had fled from the police, received no help from anyone, and in despair, had rushed into the church. Now, he was on his way home with his mother's father. I hope we make it in time for Mom. He prayed silently, continuing to give directions. Eventually, the car stopped in front of the worn-out apartment building. As Mark started to rush up the stairs, James gently placed a hand on his shoulder. Take it easy. We're with you. When they reached the third-floor corridor, police officers and a social worker were waiting outside the apartment. Mark flinched, but the gentleman stepped forward. I'm William Hamilton. The people inside are my daughter Elizabeth and my grandchildren. His voice carried an authority that no one could dispute. The officers looked at each other and immediately stepped aside. Inside, Elizabeth was still lying in bed, breathing weakly, her face pale. "Elizabeth." William's voice shook. He stood frozen, lost for words at the sight of his daughter after so long. Dr. Johnson quickly approached and began examining her. "Call an ambulance," he said while pulling out his phone. "Her heart condition is severe." "No, there's no time to wait for an ambulance." William responded instantly. "Take my car. Drive straight to the best cardiac specialist hospital." Mark's eyes widened as the situation rapidly unfolded. James, still holding the baby, was giving instructions to a nurse-like woman. Someone brought a blanket and wrapped Elizabeth in it. William approached and placed a hand on Mark's shoulder. "Don't worry. Your mother will receive the best treatment. I promise." But at that moment, Elizabeth faintly opened her eyes. "Mark." Her voice was weak. "Father, is it you?" Her tone carried a hint of disbelief. William knelt beside his daughter's bed. "Yes, Elizabeth. It's me. I've been searching for you for a long time." Tears welled up in Elizabeth's eyes. "I'm sorry, back then." "It's all right." William gently squeezed her hand. "No need to talk now. Treatment first." Dr. Johnson came closer again. "I've arranged a medical team. Let's move her as safely as possible." As two men carefully lifted the blanket-wrapped Elizabeth, Mark could only watch. James, still holding the baby, softly embraced Mark's shoulder. "Let's go together," James said gently. "We won't ever separate the three of you again." Inside the luxurious car, Elizabeth's head rested on William's lap, and her feet on Dr. Johnson's, spanning two seats to create a comfortable position. The doctor continuously checked her pulse. Mark sat in the middle seat, flanked by James holding his sister, and William, who silently watched his daughter. Mark, perched on his knees, leaned forward to better see his mother. He noticed his hand, gripping hers, was trembling slightly. "We'll be there soon," William informed the driver. The car moved quietly but swiftly. As they drove, William frequently issued instructions via his mobile phone, arranging for the best doctors and the best care possible. Mark gazed out the limousine window. The scenery passing by seemed entirely different from the desperate, hurried walk for help just a few hours earlier. Now, it was a lively street bustling with people, none of whom had noticed their dire situation. When his sister stirred slightly in James's arms, Mark instinctively turned. However, James, with the ease of someone who had cared for babies for years, gently patted her back. 10 minutes to the hospital," the driver announced. "Elizabeth," William whispered. "We're almost there. Just hang on a little longer." Her mother weakly opened her eyes and faintly nodded. Though pain was evident in her expression, there also seemed to be a trace of relief. As the car turned at an intersection, a large building came into view. At the front entrance, a group of medical staff in white coats was waiting, likely prepared by William's calls. As soon as the limousine stopped, the medical team sprang into action. Elizabeth was quickly moved from the car to a waiting wheelchair. The doctors exchanged quick commands and wheeled her straight to the treatment room. Mark tried to follow his mother, but James gently put a hand on his shoulder. "Let the doctors take care of it now." In the corridor outside the treatment room, Mark was guided to sit. James spoke to a nurse, and soon, a bottle filled with milk was prepared. His sister eagerly began to drink, moving her little hands. "Mark." William sat next to him, his expression solemn beneath which lay a deep fatigue. "You did well." Mark simply nodded, feeling the tension of the entire ordeal begin to ebb away. Suddenly, tears started flowing. William drew him close. "It's okay to cry. You don't have to be strong alone anymore." At those words, Mark's emotions overwhelmed him, and he sobbed into his grandfather's chest. When the treatment room door opened, a doctor came out. "Mr. Hamilton," he said solemnly, "your daughter's condition has stabilized. She will need to be in the ICU for observation for a while, but her life is no longer in danger. William's face softened. Thank you. Can I see Mom? When Mark asked with apprehension, the doctor smiled kindly. Of course, you can. But she's sleeping now, so be quiet. In the ICU, Mark sat beside his mother. Elizabeth's complexion was slowly improving. The quiet drip of the four marked the silence comfortably. Mom? Mark gently held her hand. It's okay now. Everyone helped us. James approached, still holding his sister, who seemed sleepy after feeding. You must be tired too. You should rest a bit. But Mark shook his head. I want to stay here a little longer. William nodded silently and gave some instructions to a nurse. Soon, a small portable bed was brought next to Mark's chair. You can lie down here. Don't worry, we'll take turns watching over her. Though Mark hesitated, a wave of exhaustion hit him as he realized he hadn't eaten since morning. Seeing this, William signaled to a nurse. Soon, warm soup and a sandwich were brought to him. Eat something and then rest. Mark nodded silently and began sipping the soup, feeling the warm liquid spreading comfort inside him. In James's arms, his sister was already breathing peacefully in sleep. After eating, Mark lay down on the portable bed, still holding his mother's hand. As his vision blurred, someone gently covered him with a blanket. You did well, were the last words he heard before falling into a deep sleep. In his dreams, he was picnicking in the park with his father. His dad was smiling, lifting his sister, and gently patting Mark's shoulder. His mother looked healthy, pulling out homemade sandwiches under the dappled sunlight. The grass under them was filled with the laughter of his family, a warm, gentle scene. But the peaceful dream was interrupted by noisy voices in the hallway. Jonathan Foster is not on the pediatric ward visitation list. I'm from the Hamilton family. Elizabeth and I were engaged, no, longtime acquaintances. Mark rubbed his sleepy eyes and sat up. Looking at the clock, he had been asleep for about 3 hours. His mother was still sleeping, the 4 drip quietly marking time. I'm sorry, but visitation requires permission. The nurse's voice came again. Is the Hamilton family baby on this floor? The 7-month-old one. I'm concerned. His voice carried an unnatural edge. Mark quietly let go of his mother's hand and gently opened the door to peek into the hallway. Near the elevator hall, he saw a stranger in an expensive suit talking to a nurse. The man seemed impatient. Mr. Foster, the list of approved visitors comes directly from Mr. William Hamilton. The man interrupted the nurse irritably. Understood, I'll confirm with him directly. Mark watched the man's retreating figure with suspicion. Mentioning his sister's name and claiming to be from the Hamilton family, who was this man? Feeling uneasy, Mark got into the elevator to go to the pediatric floor. I wonder if something's happened to Kate. Worried, he pressed the button. Although reluctant to leave his mother's sick room, he was slightly anxious about his sister. When the elevator arrived at the pediatric floor, Mark spotted a nurse. Just as he was about to ask about Kate, he saw that man talking to someone who appeared to be a clerk across the nurse's station. I was sent by Mr. William Hamilton to check on his granddaughter. I'm sorry, but the visitor list. Mark decided to observe for a bit and entered a nearby waiting area. The man took out his cell phone and began to talk. Everything is set for taking the baby out. We'll use this chaos, yes, it's time for payback. Mark's spine chilled. The man looked around the hallway and then lowered his voice further. I'll take Elizabeth's child. It's payback for her leaving me, her fiancé, 8 years ago. Mark gasped. Kate was the target, he had to alert someone. But his mother's room was on a different floor. There was a nurse at the station who had earlier turned away Jonathan. She might listen to him. Concentrating fully, trying to make as little noise as possible, Mark quietly headed towards the nurse's station. Once the man was out of sight, Mark approached the nurse. Excuse me. Mark called out in a soft voice. Could you please call Mr. William Hamilton? It's urgent. The nurse paused her work and looked down at Mark. Remembering the earlier man or sensing the seriousness in Mark's expression, she nodded immediately. Understood. I'll contact him right away. She reached for the internal phone. Please wait here. Thank you. That man. Before he could finish, footsteps sounded from down the hallway. Mark turned and his heart dropped. Jonathan was coming back. The nurse hung up the phone and placed a hand on Mark's shoulder. Mr. Hamilton is on his way, she whispered, then turned to face Jonathan. I'm just concerned about Elizabeth, my sister's former fiancée. Jonathan told the nurse. I've been worried about her for the past 8 years. But on the phone, Mark shouted. He said he was going to make her pay. He's planning to take my sister. Jonathan's expression froze for a moment, which the nurse did not miss. She quickly reached for the emergency button. Damn. Jonathan clenched his teeth. So it comes to this. As he started to run towards the baby's room amidst the confusion, the elevator doors opened. James was the first to emerge from the elevator, instantly assessing the situation and yelling down the hallway at Jonathan. Stop. At his shout, Jonathan halted. His previously calm expression was gone, his face twisted in anger. Then, William appeared. Any remaining composure vanished from Jonathan's face. Foster. William's voice was low and heavy. Mark told me he overheard your phone call. To think you would target a young life. Mr. Hamilton. Jonathan stepped back. The kid heard it? He sensed the danger and alerted us immediately. James's eyes searched for Mark and nodded in gratitude when he found him. Thanks to his quick thinking, Kate is safe. Security officers had surrounded Jonathan, there was no escape. Mark watched from behind the nurse. He didn't fully grasp the adult's conversation, but he understood that his sister and his family were safe. When William spotted Mark, he left Jonathan to the security and approached slowly. Thank you for protecting my granddaughter. His voice was gentle and warm. I had to protect my sister. Mark said, a bit sheepishly. I made a promise to Mom. At that moment, a nurse came running down the hallway. Elizabeth has woken up. Mark instinctively stepped forward, and James gently placed his hand on Mark's shoulder. Let's go. Your mother surely wants to see her brave son. Before getting into the elevator, Mark glanced back toward the pediatric ward. He could hear Kate crying. It's okay. James assured him. The nurses are taking care of her. As they stepped off the elevator, a doctor was standing in front of his mother's room. Mark paused momentarily, but the doctor nodded at him with a warm smile. Upon entering the room, his mother was sitting up in bed slightly. Her complexion was still pale, but her eyes were open and clear. Mark. Elizabeth smiled weakly when she saw her son. Mark rushed to the bed and took his mother's hand. Mom. I'm sorry for worrying you. Elizabeth began, but Mark shook his head. It's okay. I took care of Kate while you rested. The atmosphere in the room shifted slightly. Elizabeth noticed William and James standing behind her son. Father. Elizabeth. William stepped forward. His stern face was touched with deep emotion. I've been looking for you for a long time. I'm sorry. Tears started to flow from Elizabeth's eyes. It's okay. William took her hand. I should be the one to apologize. You're feeling. He choked on his words. I should have understood more about David. Brother. Elizabeth noticed James. Elizabeth, Mark did an incredible job. James said with a gentle smile. This morning, when your condition suddenly worsened, he carried his sister and desperately sought help, and he made it to the church. Thanks to Mark's courage, we were able to find you. Elizabeth looked at her son and gently caressed his cheek. Mark. I'm sorry. But you really did well. That's not all. William continued. He just protected his sister from danger. As a fine brother, turning to his daughter, Elizabeth, you've raised this boy well. As a father, I'm proud. Elizabeth looked puzzled. From danger. James began to explain the situation about the former fiancé, Jonathan, showing up and how Mark had noticed his scheme. Elizabeth's face turned pale. Jonathan was after Kate. Don't worry. The guards took him away. He won't get near her again. Mom, I heard that man on the phone saying he was going to take her away. So I told the nurse, and she alerted everyone. Elizabeth hugged Mark tightly as he puffed out his chest with pride. Oh, Mark, you were truly brave. Weren't you scared? Yes, I was scared. But Dad always said, you have to protect the people who are important to you. The room fell silent at those words. Tears welled up in Elizabeth's eyes again. Just then, a nurse came in with Kate, saying, I heard Mother woke up. And smiling. Elizabeth stretched out her arms and took Kate, who immediately buried her face in her mother's chest and made a small sound of relief. You both did well. Elizabeth said, stroking her baby's head and pulling Mark closer. Both of you. William stood by the window, looking out. White clouds floated in the gentle sunlight that filled the room. He turned back to look at the three of them. It seems like the morning's chaos was a lie. His voice was calm. I've been waiting so long for the family to be together like this. James placed his hand on Mark's shoulder. It really turned out well. His words carried a deep relief. Mark, sitting next to his mother and holding Kate's little hand, listened to the adults talk. Everything had changed so suddenly, and it felt a bit surreal. But seeing his mother's expression soften, he felt sure it was all for the best. Late that night, Mark woke up on the sofa in his mother's hospital room. Kate had already been returned to her room in the pediatric ward, and Elizabeth was sleeping quietly. The night sky outside was filled with stars, and the city lights twinkled like stars on the ground. Mark slowly got up and walked to the window. From morning till now, it all feels like a long dream. But listening to his mother's calm breathing, he knew it was all real. He no longer needed to run around alone. There was no need to desperately protect his sister anymore. Gently leaving the room, he encountered the night shift nurse in the hallway. Can I go see Kate? He asked, and she nodded with a kind smile. Before boarding the elevator, Mark touched the butterfly necklace around his neck, a precious talisman his mother had entrusted to him, now strangely linking him to his fate. Upon reaching the pediatric ward where Kate was sleeping, he found an unexpected figure there. William was sitting quietly, watching over Kate. Noticing Mark's entrance, William softly turned around. Can't sleep? Mark nodded. I'm worried about my sister. Come sit. William gestured to the chair next to him. They sat together, watching the sleeping baby. Your father was a wonderful man. William said after a pause. Yes. He always took great care of us. Your mother did the same. She has raised you to be so wonderful. Mark nodded silently. Kate, as if dreaming, showed a small smile. Mark. William paused, searching for words. I want to raise you as my dear grandchildren, of course, keeping your father's memory alive forever. Mark was silent for a moment, then slowly spoke. Since Dad passed away, Mom has been trying very hard. But sometimes she seems very lonely. So, Mark continued. If it makes Mom smile, that's what I want. William took a deep breath, his large hand resting gently on Mark's head. Thank you, Mark. Outside, a new dawn was approaching. Weeks later, in the large living room by the fireplace of the Hamilton household, Mark was playing with Kate. The winter sun streamed through the large windows, bathing the room in soft light. Kate, looking up at her brother, reached out her small hands with a laugh. It's almost lunchtime. Elizabeth said just as the room's door gently opened. Grace, Elizabeth's mother, entered with a soft smile. I'll prepare some milk and a light meal for Kate. she said gracefully, touching Kate's cheek. Since moving back to her parents' home, the grandmother had been gradually, yet very tenderly, bonding with her grandchildren. "I'll help, Mother." When Elizabeth tried to stand up, Grace shook her head. "No, you relax," Grace insisted, picking up Kate. "She has such a lovely smile." Tears glistened in Elizabeth's eyes. Her mother had never spoken of the past before. "Mark, can you help Grandma in the kitchen?" Grace smiled, and Mark got up happily. On their way to the kitchen, Mark looked up at his grandmother's profile. Initially tense when they first met, he now naturally held her hand. "Could you warm the milk, Mark?" Grace asked as she placed Kate in a high chair. "In the top shelf of the fridge." "Yes." In the living room, Elizabeth sat alone, staring into the fireplace. She sensed a change in her mother, who had maintained silence for years to honor her husband William, now smiling and spending time with her grandchildren. Soon, Kate's cheerful voice came from the kitchen. Mark was skillfully helping her eat. Elizabeth smiled quietly. The precious memories with David and the warm moments with her new family seemed to be slowly connecting. "Elizabeth." Grace called after lunch, inviting her daughter to the terrace in the gentle winter sunlight. Mark was napping with Kate. "I've been looking for you all this time." Grace's voice trembled slightly. But when he was angry, no one could speak up. Elizabeth quietly observed her mother's profile. "I regret it, though. I should have been more empathetic back then, tried to understand David better." "Mother. You chose him, yet we only saw him through a lens of prejudice." Grace sighed deeply. Seeing Mark makes it clear how wonderful David was. Tears filled Elizabeth's eyes. David was really kind. He worked from early morning until late at night but always played with Mark when he got home. "Will you tell me about it?" Grace took her daughter's hand. "Please share all your memories with me." Elizabeth looked up at the sky for a while as if searching for words, but eventually, she began to speak quietly. "I remember the day we first met vividly. I was reading in the garden, and the wind blew the pages of my book." As Elizabeth recounted the moment, her expression gradually softened. David didn't say a word, he just went right over and picked up the pages. Then, he started leaving small bouquets of flowers at my reading spot every morning, without saying anything. Grace listened intently to her daughter, nodding occasionally and smiling at times. He was never flashy, but was more sincere and kinder than anyone else. "I can never forget the look on his face when Mark was born. I had never seen him so happy." "It was like that, was it?" Grace's eyes were also filled with tears. "Back then, we were all too concerned with social status, failing to see what truly mattered." The sound of winter trees swaying in the wind could be heard from the garden. But, living with regret isn't an option anymore. Grace straightened her back and faced her daughter. "What I can do now is love you, Mark, and Kate as much as I can." "Mother. Those kids, they really did well. Especially Mark. He tried so hard to protect his sister with his tiny body." Elizabeth nodded. "He's just like David in that respect. He holds protecting others as his highest virtue." "Yes, and that's why we adults must not let those children feel alone anymore." At that moment, they heard the children's voices inside the house. It seemed they had woken up from their naps. "Let's go inside." When Grace stood up, Elizabeth followed suit. "Mother." Elizabeth grabbed her mother's sleeve. "Thank you for listening to my story." Grace smiled warmly and nodded. The two walked back into the house, shoulder to shoulder. Upon returning to the living room, they found Mark standing up, rubbing his eyes while holding Kate. The afternoon sun gently illuminated the sleepy siblings. "Did you sleep well?" When Elizabeth asked, Mark smiled faintly. Kate reached out her tiny hands towards her mother. "Mark, could you help me make some tea?" "Yes." Mark followed his grandmother to the kitchen. He felt that his mother and grandmother had been discussing something important. Their eyes were a bit red, but their expressions were strangely bright. While preparing the tea in the kitchen, Mark quietly asked his grandmother. "Grandma, were you and Mom talking about something?" Grace paused for a moment, looking into her grandson's face. "Yes. Your mother was telling me about your father." Mark widened his eyes in surprise. It was the first time he heard his grandmother mention his father. Grace quickly began pouring the tea, pausing for a moment to find the right words, and asked quietly, "Mark, could you tell me about your father, too?" "What?" "I didn't try to know him back then, and it still bothers me. So, I'd love to hear anything you remember about him." As the aroma of tea filled the quiet kitchen, Mark thought for a moment before responding. "Dad was really kind. Even if I cried when I fell, he never got mad." And just then, William returned from work. The atmosphere seemed to freeze for a moment, but he slowly approached the table and quietly said, "May I also listen?" Grace looked towards her husband. The man who had for many years forbidden even mentioning David's name was now ready to listen to his grandson. Mark hesitated for a moment, but the sincere look in his grandfather's eyes gave him the courage to speak. "Dad always took us to the park on his days off. He'd push me on the swings, race me, and, even though work was hard, he always came home with a smile." His voice faltered. Elizabeth, holding Kate, had also entered the room. William sighed deeply. "Back then, I cared more about our family's reputation than my daughter's happiness." "Honey." Grace placed her hand over his. "Let's visit David's grave." William looked around at his family. "Let's all go together." Tears spilled from Elizabeth's eyes. Mark squeezed her hand, and Kate let out a small sound. In the warmth of the fireplace, a new bond quietly began to sprout within the family. The following weekend, they visited David's grave. "Dad." Mark began softly. "Our family has grown, but we will never forget you." Elizabeth took a step forward and gently touched the tombstone. "David, because of you, I became stronger. Mark is growing up to be kind and brave, just like you." William spoke quietly as if addressing David himself. "If I hadn't been so stubborn back then, I might have been able to meet you while you were still alive. Father, I believe David always hoped that we would reunite." "So." "Yes." William slowly stepped forward. "From now on, I will protect your family." Mark watched silently. The wind picked up slightly, rustling the trees. Looking up, he saw a single white butterfly dancing in the sky, out of season. When they returned home, the maids greeted them quietly. Dinner was already supposed to be prepared, but Grace headed to the kitchen to give some instructions to the chef. "I want tonight's dinner to be special," she said as she walked to the kitchen, her usual elegance returning. Grace's voice echoed around the mansion as she searched for an item. "Please find the recipe for apple pie." William placed an old album he brought from the study on the living room table. "Elizabeth, I want you to see this." William opened the album. Inside were pictures of a young mother, playing in the rose garden, smiling in front of a grand piano, and beaming at a lavish birthday party. "We always wished for your happiness," William said quietly. But it manifested in the wrong way. Elizabeth slowly turned the pages, her voice trembling. "Father, you kept all these pictures. I couldn't bring myself to throw them away." Grace returned and sat down on the sofa. Mark was captivated by a photo of his mother as a baby, looking remarkably like Kate. Soon, the butler announced that dinner was ready. In the dining room, the chef's special dinner was served along with Grace's nostalgic apple pie. "You've always loved this since you were little, haven't you?" Grace smiled at Elizabeth. Mark felt happy at this sight, yet he also felt a touch of sadness. He remembered meals with his father. But he believed his father would be pleased. This thought made him feel a bit better. After dinner had wound down, William stood up before dessert. "Could you come to my study with me for a moment, Mark?" Mark looked at his mother, who nodded kindly, and he followed his grandfather to the study. Beyond the heavy doors lay a room lined from floor to ceiling with books. William pulled an old leather box from a drawer in his large desk. This is a watch that my father gave me when I was about your age. William quietly opened the box. I want you to have it. Mark gasped. The simple yet elegant silver watch reflected the light softly. Are you sure I can have this? Yes. William nodded. You are a grandson I am truly proud of. You've done well protecting your sister and helping your mother. William's hand rested gently on Mark's head. The warmth of his large hand seemed to melt something inside Mark. Your father would be proud of you too. Mark felt tears welling up in his eyes. William gently took the watch out and placed it in Mark's palm. The weight of the watch felt like nothing he had ever held before. From now on, we'll protect you, but I want you to keep trying to protect Kate as you have been. Yes. Mark cradled the watch carefully. Thank you, Grandpa. Let's go, it's time for dessert. William gently pushed on Mark's shoulder. A special apple pie is waiting. As they left the study, Elizabeth was waiting in the hallway. She noticed the watch in Mark's hand and tears sparkled in her eyes. Mark. Elizabeth embraced her son. You've really grown into a wonderful young man. They returned to the dining room, where Grace was holding Kate. The baby smiled and reached out her hands to her brother when she saw him. Mark gently touched her cheek. Outside, snow began to quietly fall. The warmth of the fireplace lit the room, and the scent of warm apple pie filled the air. Mark felt the weight of the watch in his hand and was enveloped in the warmth of his new family. Later that night, Mark stood by the window in his room, gazing at the watch illuminated by the light from the window. 8 years ago, this room belonged to his mother. It felt a bit too large for him now, but having his sister's room next door, where he could hear Kate's cries, was reassuring. The light was still on in his mother's room. Elizabeth was probably still awake, perhaps overwhelmed by the many changes. Mark traced the date engraved on the back of the watch with his finger. He wondered if his grandfather William had felt the same way when he received this watch. Suddenly, the door of the room opened quietly, and his mother peeked in. Are you still up? Yeah. I just can't seem to sleep. Elizabeth sat next to Mark, gazing out at the night view. Even in silence, there was no discomfort between them. You must be tired? Elizabeth asked gently. A lot has happened, hasn't it? Mark nodded. Then, he voiced a concern that had been on his mind for a while. Mom, are you happy? Elizabeth looked at her son with a slight surprise, then smiled gently. Yes. Despite some hard times, the days I spent with your father, and now with you and your siblings, are all my precious happiness. Just then, a small cry from Kate could be heard from the next room. I'll go check on her. As Mark started to get up, his mother grasped his hand. The nanny's looking after her. You rest tonight. Mark paused, then nodded. Suddenly overwhelmed, he clung to his mother. Mom. All his pent-up feelings, his bravado, everything spilled out. Elizabeth embraced her son warmly in return. You've done well, for me and for Kate. Feeling his mother's warm and gentle warmth, Mark cried deeply. Elizabeth gently stroked her son's back, feeling his small body shake, staying by his side the entire time. Mark deeply felt the happiness of being his true self again. Hey, Mom. Mark said in a soft voice, his face buried in his mother's chest. Can we go to the park together tomorrow? This simple request warmed Elizabeth's heart. Her son, who had been so focused on his sister, was finally expressing his own desires. Yes, of course. Just the two of us for a change. Mark looked up, smiling at his mother's words. His expression was that of the young boy Elizabeth had almost forgotten. Outside, the snow began to fall even harder. But inside, the room was warm, as if time had stopped. The next morning was a clear winter's day. The park was aglow with the snow from the night before. Mark and his mother left fresh footprints in the snow as they walked. Did you used to play here a lot when you were little, Mom? Yes. That swing has been here since I was a child. They stood in front of the swing, and Elizabeth sat down. Mark sat on the swing next to her. They started to sway gently in the winter morning sun. "This is fun," Mark murmured softly. Elizabeth watched her son's profile, enveloped in a feeling of happiness. "Hey, Mark. What shall we play next?" Mark looked up at the sky. "Let's make a snowman." They began rolling the snow together, and Mark's face became more animated. Elizabeth felt reassured seeing her child regain his youthful expressions. "This will be the head," Elizabeth said as she placed a small snowball on top. Mark started looking around. "For the eyes and nose, let's use these." He found some pebbles and ran over to them. Elizabeth squinted with a smile as they lost themselves in building the snowman, forgetting the cold. "Look, it's done." Mark ran around the snowman with joy as a voice called out from behind. "Elizabeth." "Mark." Turning around, they saw Grace holding Kate, with William and James standing beside her. "Look at our snowman." Mark pointed proudly. Kate reached out her hands with a smile. "What a lovely snowman." Grace smiled. "It's getting cold. Let's head back home." "Yes." William's voice prompted Elizabeth to take Mark's hand and walk back to the family. James hoisted Mark onto his shoulders with a smile. "Mark, how about we play a card game when we get home?" "Yeah." Their 6 shadows stretched across the snowy field, illuminated by the morning sun. Elizabeth looked up at the winter blue sky, where a bird spread its wings and soared into the light.